Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners! In the recent weeks, Central Asia has made some important progress in regional cooperation. And that is what we will be looking at more closely today. But before I invite you to listen to my conversation with Dr. Filippo Costa Buranelli, who is an expert in regional politics in Central Asia, let me give you some background into what has happened. Central Asian borders, and especially in the Fergana Valley, where Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan meet, have been contested since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Some of the new Central Asian countries were then left with exclaves surrounded by the territory of their neighbor. And so, Uzbekistan has several exclaves trapped in Kyrgyzstan. The biggest of them, Sokh, has a population of around 60,000 and has seen a number of inter-ethnic clashes and conflicts over scarce water resources over the years. In 2010, violence between Kyrgyz and Uzbeks broke out in southern Kyrgyzstan and left hundreds of people dead, thousands injured, and saw thousands of Uzbeks flee to their homeland. Uzbekistan then closed its border with Kyrgyzstan for 7 years. Eventually, the two countries signed a border delimitation agreement in 2022, which also somewhat calmed the tensions between Uzbeks and the Kyrgyz. But tensions in the border areas between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan persisted, including around Vorukh, the Tajik exclave with a population of around 30,000, surrounded by Kyrgyzstan. These tensions continued across the years and were mainly related to the water usage, access to roads, and infrastructure. For a number of years, however, this conflict remained low-key. In 2021, clashes turned more violent. The conflict began near a water intake in the Batken region of Kyrgyzstan, which was claimed by both countries. Kyrgyz officials were reportedly installing surveillance cameras at the site, which Tajik residents opposed. And what started as a dispute related to the use of water and involved some stone throwing soon turned into a conflict which saw around 50 people killed and 10,000 evacuated. Both sides used firearms, mortars, and heavy weaponry. The next year, in 2022, a conflict was sparked by a roadblock erected by Tajik nationals on a road contested by the Kyrgyz. This happened in January, and until September, when the biggest escalation happened, smaller tensions and shootouts were reported every now and then. But in September, Tajik officials using tanks and mortars entered Kyrgyz villages and even shelled the airport in Batken. 200 people were killed in the conflict, more than 400 were injured, and over 130,000 were displaced. Such conflicts, which involve exclaves and disputed territory, especially in the post-Soviet space, rarely end just like that. And in this case, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan share over 970 kilometers of a border, and 500 of those kilometers have been disputed. That's why it came as a great surprise, which even some commentators called a deal of the century, when Kyrgyzstan's presidents Sadyr Japarov and Tajikistan's Emomali Rahmon met in March in Bishkek and shook hands, signing a deal on border demarcation, shared access to water resources, roads, and Tajikistan's access to its Kyrgyzstan-surrounded exclave. In the process, Bishkek has made some really big concessions, which sparked criticism. It's worth noting here that one Kyrgyz activist has been arrested for her comments and one member of parliament has lost his parliamentary seat. As per the agreement, the village of Dostuk, which means friendship, will be transferred from Kyrgyzstan to Tajikistan and its population resettled. Some roads in no man's land on the border will remain neutral, and there is now a more comprehensive water sharing agreement in place. If that were not enough, in late March, presidents of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan met in Khujand, a Tajik city in the Fergana Valley close to where the borders of the three countries meet. They held a trilateral summit for the first time to sign a treaty of eternal friendship. The three presidents also unveiled a monument, and then a drone show above their heads lit up the sky with realistic 3D portraits of each of them. Finally, in early April, the first summit between Central Asia and the European Union took place in Samarkand and ended with Europe promising the region a so-called Global Gateway investment package worth 12 billion euros. This is on top of 10 billion euros that Europe promised last year to develop the Trans-Caspian Transport Corridor, which is meant to cut the overland journey from Central Asia to Europe to 15 days. It is currently unclear what exactly the Global Gateway package will include, but that's not the point. The important thing is that the promise has been made. We will definitely go back to the topic of Global Gateway package sometime in the future. But now let's move on and see what my today's guest has to say about the important deals made in the recent weeks in Central Asia and whether he thinks that this marks the end of conflict and tensions between the countries in the region. Welcome to Turan Talk. Hello, today my guest is Dr. Filippo Costa Buranelli, who is an Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews in the UK and who focuses on Central Asian politics and regional cooperation. He is also Senior Advisor to the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs on matters related to the region. Hi, Filippo.
Hi, Agnieszka, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today.
So, hi from sunny Almaty. I'm
Wonderful.
now in the region in Kazakhstan, and it's just absolutely wonderful. And you are probably...
I am at the moment in Graz. I am based in Austria for a period of research. And it is sunny here as well. But please do say hi to lovely Almaty, which is in my heart.
I definitely will. So my listeners have just listened to a short summary of what happened recently when it comes to regional cooperation in Central Asia. So the border issues that were solved after many years of conflict and, the promises that the European Union is making to Central Asia. So it seems like it's like a new opening for regional cooperation in Central Asia. Is it really? Or you think it's more like a continuation of something that's been the case for the past couple of years?
Thank you so very much for this question, which is important exactly in light of the recent events you just mentioned. I believe this is a significant continuation of very positive trends that in fact started in Central Asia in 2017-2018. So after, let's say, the consolidation of the position in power of Uzbek President Shavkat Mirziyoyev. This is not to say that what is happening now is markedly different. There are profound differences. I think we start really noticing how the spirit of cooperation is also finally touching on sensitive matters such as borders, such as territories, such as the willingness to present the region itself as a cohesive agent, right, when liaising with external partners, such as the European Union. So there are some differences, but I think these differences do build on the very important, but also deep and at times slow process of trust building and pragmatic cooperation that started almost a decade ago. At the same time, I think it is important to remember that it's not that before 2016, there was no cooperation at all. we had examples of cooperation in the past as well, but this cooperation was not, I believe, part of a structured or at least better defined regional framework of dialogue, of interaction, of expectations between the states that now does exist. So, answering your question and wrapping up, I think it is important to stress the increase and also the qualitative differences of cooperation in Central Asia in the past year or so. But at the same time, it is important to remember where this cooperation comes from. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It is the product of warmer, more positive, and more trustworthy dynamics between the regional states.
So let's go back to 2016 when Mirziyoyev came to power.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly he did to increase regional cooperation? Because let's remind our listeners that his predecessor, Islam Karimov, was not a man very eager to cooperate with his neighbors.
He was not, although it is quite ironic that in fact was Islam Karimov in the 1990s to suggest ideas such as the Central Asian Union or something that nowadays would even feel a little bit absurd, like an economic free zone in the Fergana Valley, right? These were ideas that actually were floated by him. And he also suggested this idea of Turkestan, our common home, more of a geopolitical spin, if you wish, on cooperation. But nonetheless, he had an idea of, quote unquote, the region, right? He saw Central Asia as an entity. But then, yes, with the...
So what happened, maybe, before we turn to Shavkat Mirziyoyev?
It happened, actually, that Uzbekistan started feeling, on the one hand, the benefits of sovereignty and the ability to pursue its national interest that several times clashed with those of the neighbors, and also started a period partly due to the Tajik civil war, but also partly due to the situation in Afghanistan and the terrorist attacks in Tashkent in 1999, started adopting what I call in my research a hyper-securitized approach to regional politics. Therefore, for example, interpreting sovereignty not in a cooperative way, but in a more adversarial way, right? Uzbekistan spoke of itself as a fortress, right? Which is everything but cooperative, right? Fortress is about walls, it's about division, it's about security. So it was very much this perception of Uzbekistan as the heart of Central Asia, as the balancer, right, of the region, that basically led the leadership to pursue a much more narrower set of interests and goals, dismissing cooperation with neighbors. Even if, again, Uzbekistan nonetheless managed to maintain coexistence, right? It's not at wage war with the neighbors, for example. So we need also to be careful in describing very well what happened. But certainly, after a first initial phase of proposed cooperation with neighbors, something that when I speak to diplomats, right, from those years, they labeled as romantic, right? There was this idea of somehow preserving the ties that the Soviet Union left in the region, for example. But then by discovering the advantages and the privileges of being an independent sovereign nation, understanding better its own national interest, and also feeling its own security very much attacked, whether this was true or not, it's another matter, Uzbekistan somehow retrenched. There was also other factors, okay? So the economic rise of Kazakhstan that was seen very much with suspicion in Tashkent in the 2000s, and also the fact that, I think it is a very serious factor in the equation, the interference of great powers, especially of neighboring great powers, pitching somehow Central Asian republics one against the other to pursue.
Can we name those powers? Right? Can we name those powers?
Mostly Russia. But at the same time, I think also other, if you wish, extra-regional powers. You can name China, you can name the US as well, especially during the militarized years, right, of the campaign in Afghanistan, for example, somehow pursued their own extra-regional interest in the region without necessarily pursuing, right, a strategy of bringing the regional states together. So it was a very complex mix of domestic, regional, and international factors that somehow put a lid on a more authentic spirit of cooperation And by the way, let's pay attention to the fact that I keep talking about cooperation. I'm deliberately not mentioning integration. We can speak about this later if you want, but I think cooperation is exactly the word that best describes what was attempted to be done back in the 1990s and what is being tried out now.
So let's move to Shavkat Mirziyoyev, what he did exactly.
So Mirziyoyev did a very, very precise, only apparently small change in the politics of Uzbekistan. He put Central Asia at the center of the foreign policy of the country. So his reasoning was, if we don't have good relations with our neighbors, we are basically doomed to succumb. And we are doomed basically to fall behind. If we keep erecting walls, if we keep ourselves detaching from our neighbors, this will lead to nothing but closure, and slowly this will dry out the lymph of the country. Let's not forget that Mirziyoyev was a very high-level politician back in the years of Karimov. He held very important appointments and he was very close to Karimov. Also, during his years in politics, Mirziyoyev traveled a lot to the regions, for example, and to the border regions of Uzbekistan. So he saw with his own eyes how the parts of the country bordering with the Central Asian neighbors were affected by issues very much linked to the absence of dialogue, of openness, or even basic interactions with the neighbors. There were situations in the Fergana Valley, for example, where families, right, were disjoined by the artificial borders created by the Soviet Union and then formalized by the Central Asian republics at the time of independence. And these family members, maybe part of them residing in Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan and part of them residing in Uzbekistan, could not even see each other, right? Or they would need a visa to see each other. They would not celebrate birthdays together. They would not celebrate weddings together. They could not even mourn their losses or their bereavement together because of the very strict policies at the border. So Mirziyoyev decided basically to reset all this. I think reset is the right word. And he started with Tajikistan. So in 2017, 2018, he carried out very strong bilateral dialogue with President Rahmon in Tajikistan. And there was an official visit that was reciprocated. So Rahmon traveled to Tashkent and then Mirziyoyev traveled to Dushanbe. And there was the historical landmark decision to reopen the border and also to resume air communication. Let's remember that after the Tajik civil war, basically connections between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan were basically halted. The same goes with Kyrgyzstan. Mirziyoyev decided to transform, of course, not single-handedly, right? Everything I'm saying required the understanding, the cooperation, and the good predisposition also of other actors in other states, right? So it's not that they did everything alone. But Mirziyoyev somehow renewed or created a new spirit of cooperation and trust building in Central Asia. So with Kyrgyzstan, he did the same. Recently, a couple of years ago, the border with Kyrgyzstan was finalized through the negotiations over Kempirabad. And also relations with Kazakhstan are still somehow, some people say that Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are still vying for influence in Central Asia, but this competition is much more healthy than used to be in the past. There is mutual trust between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And I think it was very significant. And if you allow me, Agnieszka, I will just mention this because I think it's important for your audience, that contrary to the established, let's call it Central Asian tradition, right? It's not something that exists really, but you can observe this pattern. Usually when a president in Central Asia wins the elections, the first foreign trip is to Moscow, right? Whether this is because of power relations, whether this is because for economic reasons or, diplomatic informal protocol, this was almost always the case. Mirziyoyev had his first trip abroad to Turkmenistan. And when this happened, the international community interested in Central Asia was shocked because everyone was expecting either Moscow or really, if anything, and we are stretching it here, Astana. But he decided to travel to Turkmenistan, and for a very good reason. He wanted to signal to Ashgabat that Ashgabat was very much welcome in this new design of Central Asia, right? There was space for Turkmenistan. The permanent neutrality of Turkmenistan would have never been considered an obstacle, but very much Uzbekistan was attaching equal importance to all the neighbors. And it was in that trip that the idea of consultative meetings of the presidents of Central Asia was first discussed. So it was an initiative coming out of the ideas of the Uzbek and the Turkmen president. And this is now why we have these meetings between the presidents that happen every year, which is pretty unique. This was not the case before, even if, of course, they met. But now this is pretty regular, pretty institutionalized, and I think it's very good for the region.
And how does Turkmenistan see this whole situation? Because, of course, we can see this increased cooperation, but Turkmenistan is still somehow on the side.
Yes. And I think this is unavoidable. It is unavoidable because of this very strong and important doctrine that Turkmenistan has of the positive and permanent neutrality. It is a policy that they interpret very strictly, and they interpret it in a very cautious way. So Turkmenistan is not opposed to dialogue, okay? And I'm using this word very consciously, is not opposed to dialogue, is not opposed to having purposeful cooperation in some specific spheres. Okay, so Turkmenistan has recently engaged in the field of education with the Central Asian neighbors, in the field of transportation and infrastructure. Turkmenistan has even recently negotiated a free trade agreement with Uzbekistan, paying attention to some of the border areas, right? So the idea of having free economic zones on the border with Uzbekistan in the area of Doshaguts, for example, between the two countries. So there is certainly involvement of Turkmenistan. As I mentioned before, the idea of the summits of the presidents actually comes from the Turkmen-Uzbek interaction in the past. So it's not that they were secluded and somehow bandwagoned, right, on this idea. So it came from there. They have also started collaborating on some environmental issues. Turkmenistan is very active, and this is, again, not surprising because it's part of the neutrality doctrine. Turkmenistan is active at the UN. Turkmenistan proposes several resolutions at the General Assembly on behalf of the region. And the region is very happy for this to happen because it is one way in which Turkmenistan can, remain attached to the regional dynamics. But you're right. At the same time, Turkmenistan is somehow very cautious and constantly reminds the other Central Asian states, and we are using here states and presidents a little bit interchangeably, right? I hope you can forgive me for this. But for example, at the last meeting, Serdar Berdimuhamedov reminded everyone that any organization, any institutionalization of the meetings of the presidents would be opposed by Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is very adamant and very clear that these meetings should stay meetings. They should not evolve into something more rigid or more bureaucratic, because that would run against the national interest of Turkmenistan, whatever that is. Right? So I think on the one hand, it is correct to say that Turkmenistan is partly involved in this, let's say, renaissance of Central Asian cooperation. But at the same time, I think it would be wrong to continue to single out Turkmenistan as not engaged, because some steps forward have indeed been made. And I could observe this personally in my activity as advisor to the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I was in Ashgabat in December, and I had meetings with diplomats, with bureaucrats, and with people involved in some of the sectors of cooperation with Central Asia. So environment, education, connectivity. And they do have a regional outlook. So they do speak with the neighbors, they do have interactions, they do participate very actively when it comes to water management, for example. Other Central Asian colleagues praise Turkmenistan for its involvement and its activity. So sometimes it's important to be in the region like you are at the moment and to observe a little bit things from a closer perspective to really understand their their existence and their progress. And I think, it's the case for Turkmenistan. Not too much cooperation, but definitely something is there, and I wouldn't rule that out.
So cooperation, obviously, when it comes to countries that are so close, like Turkmenistan and like Uzbekistan used to be, it's also a necessity to an extent. So what do you think are the most important areas of cooperation in the region? Like, what are the most kind of pressing issues that should be addressed regionally instead of like by individual states?
I can straightforwardly say the economy. That's the first issue area that comes to my mind, but also the one that is most constantly talked about by the presidents and by decision makers and diplomats, both bilaterally and at the regional level. Let me just say very, very quickly before touching on other issues that we should not forget that still, despite the regional spirit of cooperation that is growing in recent years, bilateral relations are still fundamental in Central Asia. And I would still argue that they are more predominant than regional ones. But we can discuss this later if you want. Having said this, so the economy is the first one and is the most important one, especially in light of the recent geopolitical turbulence, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the turbulence in the markets and the disruption of infrastructure and connectivity worldwide. Central Asia has realized that, connectivity and economic cooperation should be paramount. Sometimes this is easier said than done. Many people forget that when it comes to the economies of the Central Asian states, they are not often or not always complementary. There are some overlaps. So, for example, there is the case of Kyrgyz business people and producers that complain to the Kyrgyz parliament of the over-competition of Uzbek products, right? So it's not that there is the magic wand that economic cooperation will bring benefits to everyone. So there are still some frictions. But definitely cooperation in terms of trade, in terms of economic agreements, creation of industrial centers on the borders, creation of free economic zones, creation of better conditions to smoothen and make trade easier cross-border at the cross-border level is certainly the top of the agenda. Related to this is connectivity. It is infrastructure, right? Opening of new checkpoints, opening of new transit routes, opening of new air links. So last week, Kyrgyzstan announced there will be the first flights from Bishkek to Khujand, right? So it's not capital to capital anymore, but also involving other cities and other centers into this connectivity fabric that is being created. Of course, not everything comes from Central Asia. There is a lot of help coming from international institutions and donors and investors, EBRD, World Bank, European Union, China, you name it, right? But it is important that Central Asia has understood that the more tightly connected it is, the better it is for everyone. And for example, related to the economy and connectivity, there is also legal harmonization of some procedures related to those two issues, right? Recently, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan have reached an agreement on clearing paperwork for trucks and big transportation vectors moving across from Tajikistan to Uzbekistan, right? So there are no checks at the border anymore because that has been cleared. And the same is being discussed between Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. So the removal of paperwork for cargo transportation. This is maybe something tiny. Maybe this is something not on the radar of the big debates on Central Asia, but I find it fundamental. Even 10 years ago, this was unimaginable. And the fact that there are these baby steps towards the harmonization of the transportation, economic and trade tissue or fabric of Central Asia, it is very important. Then there is water. Okay, absolutely, water is at the center of the cooperation between states. It doesn't mean that there is no friction. There are still, of course, disagreements. Kyrgyzstan nominally is still a frozen member of the International Fund for the RLC, for example, although they do partake in its activities informally, but they do not officially recognized membership there at the moment because of some disagreements with neighbors. But at the same time, you have trilateral cooperation over hydroelectric powers. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan have reached an agreement to build this Kambarata-Adin hydroelectric dam or power plant in Kyrgyzstan, which is quite a unique example of trilateral cooperation in Central Asia. Uzbekistan has finally put down its, how to put it, adversarial stance, opposition, that's the word, against Rogun in Tajikistan, even if, again, it's not fully giving green light, but it has agreed to basically monitor the construction and to help, should its help be needed. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan continue to cooperate in the field of water management as well. Turkmenistan, as I mentioned before, participates in regional water management and tries its best to fulfill, its obligations. So this is also another sector where cooperation is taking place. Another very important sector of cooperation is, of course, the creation of borders of peace. Okay, so changing basically borders from areas of division to areas of encounters and meetings and harmony and peace and development. So the trilateral meeting, right, between Japarov, Mirziyoyev, Rahmon in Khujand at the end of March was the exemplification of the spirit, okay, of cooperation towards border issues. Of course, we are at the very beginning. The fact that a treaty has been signed doesn't mean there will not be problems in the future. Demarcation and delimitation has to start. But at the same time, it is very important that ultimately a tool of international law is now regulating interactions over borders. Uzbekistan has no border issues with any of its neighbors. The same goes for Turkmenistan. And Kyrgyzstan also has managed to solve its border issues with Uzbekistan. So that's another very important step. I can mention other two areas if we have time and if you're willing to do so.
Sure.
Agnieszka.
Yes.
The first one is education. And I mention this because I'm observing this from a very close perspective, working on this with Central Asian partners within the 5+1 framework with Italy. In 2021, there was the Turkestan Declaration on the creation of a single Central Asian educational space, which means the attempt to create an harmonized and synchronic space where degrees, where curricula, where teaching methods are somehow standardized and are transferable from one state to the other, keeping in mind the Bologna process that we have in Europe, right? And so we started having the first forums of rectors of universities, first forums of historians, first forums of ministries of education, which again, maybe it's soft cooperation, it's not hard cooperation, but in my optimistic view, if you don't start from the new generations, from the future generations, you are short-sighted, right? So I think it is important that cooperation is also happening at the level of people-to-people connectivity, and this is very much the case of education. And also, it's done in an issue area that is not overly sensitive. Okay, so education will be one additional area where cooperation is happening. And also the last one, it's somehow culture, right? So culture, tourism, history, once again, how to present Central Asia to the world. So at the last meeting of the three presidents, right, Japarov, Mirziyoyev, and Rahmon in Khujand, there was also a discussion on the sidelines between the ministries of culture of the three states, who agreed for the first time to have a set of, for example, exhibits, concerts, cultural events between the three states, but of course also open to the other two Central Asian states on a regular basis to ultimately transform the Fergana Valley from an area of danger, from an area of unsafety, from an area of conflict, okay, as used to be in the 1990s and the 2000s, to an area of peace, development, and prosperity. All this, of course, sounds grandiose and sounds very optimistic. We shall see how things develop on the ground. But at the same time, let me stress once again that up to 5-7 years ago, these things were totally unimaginable. So I think we should be already content with this.
Definitely. I would like to go back to the economy that you already mentioned. So we all know what's the elephant in the room, and these are tariffs. And and Donald Trump, who recently, was re-elected in the United States and has been reshaping basically the world as we know it. So how does Central Asian countries respond to the US changing policy? What are the moods?
Yes, that's a very, very good question. And as a premise to my answer, I would like to share with the audience that, I'm not an expert in international political economy. So what I'm going to say will be a little bit general, but will hopefully give an indication of how Central Asia is adapting to the Trump era or the second Trump era, let's say. There are two things really that I want to say. The first one is that by definition, by strategy, by posture, Central Asian diplomacy is a diplomacy that is pragmatic. So whoever is in charge, whoever is the leader anywhere in the world, the Central Asian republics will deal with them, irrespectively of ideological differences, irrespectively of different positions on matters pertaining to international politics or international economy. So there has, of course, been caution. There has a little bit of wait and see attitude. But all Central Asian states are, of course, happy to have a dialogue and to have the ear of the White House. This is also for reasons of diplomatic and international prestige, right? I think this is unavoidable when you are at the heart of Eurasia, surrounded by, big powers, which, by the way, are also nuclear. So having a friendly ear in Washington always helps. This is why there hasn't been any antagonistic posture coming from the Central Asian capitals. There is the attitude to look for grounds on cooperation. Marco Rubio has been very much adamant. He has been in contact with all Central Asian states and foreign ministers, stating that the White House continues to see cooperation with Central Asia in a very positive light, protecting sovereignty, fostering cooperation on rare minerals, critical sectors of the economy, and so on and so forth. So the starting ground is a positive one. Then, of course, tariffs come in. Here, the kind of good news is that the Central Asian countries do not export that much to the US. This is because, again, of complementarity of economies. This is because of demand and supply issues, and also because of logistics, right? But at the same time, tariffs do create shocks that are of second order, right? So even if you don't have a trade relation with the sanctioner, you do suffer from shocks deriving from the global economy because of the tariffs themselves. So in a way, the Central Asian republics have been bracing for this. And this is why, and I go back to what I said before about economic cooperation and diversification of connectivity, they are trying as much as possible to reach out to other markets, exactly to have more cards to play. So when the tariffs are in place, countries that have been hit severely, okay, so I think of China, for example, just to give you an example, but also other regional players, India, Iran, Turkey, and other markets that Central Asia can explore, then it is exactly those markets that Central Asia will insist on when it comes to economic cooperation. The hope is that this economic turbulence will stop. This week, we have seen also falling oil prices, which has sent Kazakhstan a little bit in a state of alert because the Brent prices have fallen quite significantly. So there are other more complex conjunctures when it comes to the international economy, and the unpredictability of the Trump administration doesn't help in that respect. But I think, as I said before, that ultimately Central Asian diplomacy is a very pragmatic one, and therefore will continue to work for negotiated solutions on the best outcome they can get out of the relations with the White House.
We've recently seen the first ever EU Central Asia Summit, and Ursula von der Leyen made a lot of promises. I'm not sure if these promises will be kept, obviously. I mean, none of us does. But what does it show us? I mean, is Europe kind of increasingly interested in investing in the region? And if so, why?
That's a very good question, the why question, which I think we can and should definitely unpack. Let me just tell you and the audience that, again, I had a close perspective on this meeting because I was in Tashkent the week before that meeting for the EU Central Asian Think Tank Forum, which had exactly the task of somehow working on the agenda for the Samarkand Forum between the EU and the Central Asian presidents. So I could observe very much what were the issues the states were working on and what was prioritized. If you ask me, this first meeting between the EU authorities and the Central Asian presidents is very important because it ultimately signals the politicization of EU Central Asia relations. So it's not just about the economy, it's not just about connectivity, it's a partnership that now is at the highest level. Okay, it is the first time that the president of the Commission and the president of the Council met with the 5 Central Asian presidents. And it's the first time that ultimately Central Asia spoke with a regional partner as a region itself, somehow showing that Central Asia is capable, when necessities compel, to present itself as a regional group. I deliberately avoid the word bloc because I don't like it for a series of reasons, but regional group. And quite significantly, it was Turkmenistan that actually voiced this group-like posture during the meeting. So I think that's another positive sign that Turkmenistan feels somehow involved. Now, why it's becoming closer, this partnership? Well, I think we have to go back to the global turbulences, right, that we observed before and we commented on before. Partly on the background, there is still Russia's invasion of Ukraine that keeps sending shocks on all fronts, from the security front to the diplomatic front, to the connectivity front, to the economic front. Then there is an increasingly unreliable partner across the Atlantic, that is Washington, that is totally unpredictable and very much assertive. Some commentators have used the adjective bullying when it comes to the EU. So the EU is somehow now compelled to diversify not only its economic and trade outlook, but also its geopolitical outlook. The EU is somehow waking up once again to history and has discovered it has to be present where concrete issues of security and geopolitics are taking shape. And Central Asia is one of those areas. It is not by chance that if you look at the European Union strategy of 2019, already elements of rule of law, democracy, good governance, human rights protection are much less significant as opposed to the first European strategy of 2007. Right? So there is already a more pragmatic approach in the documents. And if you look at the agenda of the EU Central Asian Summit in Samarkand of last week, then you see that the predominant element was the geoeconomic component, right? This deal over critical minerals, this cooperation over critical minerals and rare earth is somehow what drove this meeting, on top of other issues, of course, pertaining to connectivity, pertaining to trade, pertaining to partnerships also on environmental matters, which is a very important issue for the Central Asian states, but is the race to critical minerals that was very much at the heart of the agenda. And here I have to make an observation, if we have time. This is something that, again, I can share from my participation in the think tank forum in Tashkent.
Please do.
There is, if you look at the discussion, there is this constant emphasis on partnership, right? EU Central Asia partnership in the field of critical minerals. But then if you look at how this partnership would be carried out, it is ultimately a transaction. Okay, it's the European Union paying for rare minerals that are sourced and ultimately refined in Central Asia and then sold out. That's not a partnership, that's a transaction. So what was the object of discussion in the different circles, again, prior to the meeting in Samarkand, was that the partnership, for being authentic, should involve a much more rooted presence of the European Union in the region. You want rare minerals, then why don't you invest here? Why don't you source yourself them here in Central Asia, as opposed just to pay for them to get them shipped? So it's also a matter of local economies. It's a matter of creating jobs. It's a matter of investments. It's a matter of seeing Central Asian states and societies as equals in the partnership, right? Because otherwise the level of asymmetry is still there. It's just the language that changes. So Central Asia, of course, welcomes this partnership. And I think the final communiqué was different from previous meetings at the EU Central Asia level, right? Even if this was the first one that of such a high level, in the sense that really there is the chance for a qualitative change in EU Central Asia relations. But I think it is important to remember that these relations should now be on an equal basis, because in the current geopolitical situation, we are seeing that nobody can afford to treat other states in a hierarchical or patronizing way anymore. The world is becoming genuinely multipolar. So there are options everywhere. If interests are not met, then people and states just look elsewhere for opportunities. So I think this will be very important for the future.
If we talk about connectivity and if we talk about equality in different partnerships, I think it's very important also to mention Afghanistan.
Of course.
Because Central Asia has been engaging with the new Taliban regime in Afghanistan much more than other countries worldwide. So what can you say about this Central Asian cooperation when it comes to Afghanistan? Which areas are here crucial for the region?
You are very correct in putting Afghanistan in the picture, because, of course, it is unavoidable for the Central Asian states to neglect their neighbor and the importance that their neighbor have on matters pertaining to economy, security, environmental management, and also basic human rights. It is important because, well, differently from the Western world, the Central Asian states do share a border with Afghanistan. Well, 3 of them at least, right? But the proximity to it, of course, makes it paramount to engage with the Taliban authorities. So first, let's clarify something for our audience. There is no Central Asian strategy yet towards Afghanistan. There are national strategies that present some elements of concertation and coordination. Uzbekistan has been paramount in engaging Afghanistan on trade matters, diplomatic matters, environmental matters. Let's not forget that Afghanistan has started the construction of this canal, right? The so-called Kosh-Tepa Canal on the Amu Darya basin that will have inevitably an impact on the water balance and the whole environmental setting of broader Central Asia. But nonetheless, Mirziyoyev and Uzbek diplomats have been adamant that this is a full right of Afghanistan. It's actually, according to international law, something that Afghanistan can do. So Uzbekistan has, since the events of August 2021, adopted a very pragmatic approach to Afghanistan. The creation of connectivity, the railway project, basically from Termez to Mazar al-Sharif in the north of Afghanistan, is a paramount project in this respect. Trade has resumed. The creation of joint ventures is constantly being discussed. Uzbek diplomats travel to Afghanistan and vice versa. And Afghan representatives do travel to Uzbekistan as well. Mirziyoyev has spoken more than one time about Afghanistan being part of Central Asia. So also at the linguistic level, the rhetorical level, it's very, very important to see how Afghanistan is progressively included in regional dynamics. And now there have been some talks about creating a regional dialogue for the security of Afghanistan with the inclusion of Afghan authorities as well. So let's see how this works out in the next few months, but the project is there. Kazakhstan has removed the Taliban from the list of terrorist organizations of the country, and that was done, according to my sources and to the dialogue I had with diplomats across the region, unilaterally. without consulting with Central Asian neighbors. And again, this is something that the Kazakh authorities have the right to do. And again, it signals how pragmatism is very much the philosophy at the heart of engagement with Afghanistan. Trade, energy provision, humanitarian aid, diplomatic engagement, dialogue at the political level. This is all part of the Kazakhstani agenda when it comes to relations with Kazakhstan. There are, of course, informal envoys that travel back and forth. None of the Central Asian countries has formally recognized the Taliban government for UN membership purposes or from the perspective of international law. But de facto recognition has happened. Kyrgyzstan the same. Kyrgyzstan, if I'm not mistaken, I will have to double check this, but I think has an embassy in Kabul. And dialogue continues. The provision of energy, the provision of electricity, the provision of humanitarian aid continues. And the same with Turkmenistan. I mean, Turkmenistan has resumed conversations over TAPI, the so-called TAPI, the Turkmen-Afghan-Pakistani-Indian pipeline that would ultimately provide Afghanistan with much needed energy. And economic cooperation is discussed. Provision, again, of oil and gas is a thing. And dialogue continues. The relations between Turkmenistan and Afghanistan is a long-standing one. Even in the mid-1990s, the Taliban had an embassy in Ashgabat. So of all the Central Asian states, the Turkmens are those with a more established relations with Afghanistan and the Taliban regime. Tajikistan is a little bit out of the picture here because Tajikistan has adopted a more confrontational stance against Afghanistan. They keep talking about not recognizing the Taliban regime until the government and the cadres of the government are inclusive of ethnic Tajiks, which, remember, amount to almost 30% of the population of Afghanistan, especially in the northeastern area. Also for historical reasons, Massoud and the resistance to the Taliban was led by Tajiks in Afghanistan. So on the one hand, on the political hand, there is opposition to the Taliban, or let's say they're not welcoming them. But at the same time, guess what? Tajikistan keeps providing humanitarian aid, keeps providing food, keeps providing energy at sub-market prices, exactly because they understand that Afghanistan is a linchpin of security. If Afghanistan falls, then it is a problem for the whole Central Asia. So once again, pragmatism. When it comes to human rights, you can imagine they're not on the top of the agenda. But I think it is important to say that in all venues, be they the meeting of neighboring states of Afghanistan, the Moscow talks, the meeting with the EU, or other diplomatic settings where Afghanistan is present or discussed, the Central Asian states do reiterate that fundamental human rights, including education for women and girls, is a paramount condition for full-fledged cooperation with Afghanistan. So it is there, but at the same time, as I mentioned before, pragmatism continues even without them, which is part of politics, I'm afraid.
We are coming to an end, so if you allow me to ask you one last question.
Of course.
Based on all your talks behind the scenes, because I know that you had a lot of them, and you do have lots of very good connections. So what are the areas that still need to be addressed when it comes to cooperation in Central Asia? What are the areas in which states, maybe when it comes to bilateral relations, obviously, states still clash, and where there is potential for conflict?
Right. So I would say that water is still a very politicized issue or topic. It doesn't mean that cooperation doesn't happen, as I mentioned before. But of course, water is a very sensitive issue, both at the bilateral level and also at the regional level. Luckily, I think conflict over water as we speak is not a concrete possibility, in the sense that there may be some tit-for-tat actions or some sort of coercive diplomacy, if you wish. But at the same time, the times where Karimov threatened war over water are far behind us. Nonetheless, let's remember that the Kyrgyz-Tajik conflict of a couple of years ago were exactly on issues pertaining to land and water. And here it is the second issue, which I think the borders, especially in the Fergana Valley and between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Yes, the treaty has been signed. Yes, the process of delimitation and demarcation is now launched, but it doesn't mean it will be fully peaceful. It doesn't mean it will be smooth and without any obstacles.
Especially that we're talking about resettlement of populations, right?
Exactly. So here, I mean, I really don't want to get too academic here, but here there is the notion of authoritarian peace building developed by people like Nick McGoran, David Lewis, John Ettershaw, that very much helps us understand what is going on there, right? So if you look at the experience of the Kyrgyz-Uzbek border, well, the border issue was resolved. Well, population were basically taken and transferred without being consulted, without being basically involved in negotiations from one area to the other, losing everything they had, losing their, material and ideational roots to the land they always inhabited for the sake of interstate peace. And again, you can see, the profound illiberal and authoritarian elements in this, because ultimately it's a decision enforced on you. But at the same time, this is done on the altar of interstate coexistence and peaceful cooperation. So I think the same will happen between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Whether this will happen without clashes, I don't have the crystal ball, and I cannot predict that. But somehow people think of Central Asian presidents as people with superpowers who decide everything everywhere. But that's not the case. Armed clashes in remote areas of the border, far away from the capital, can happen even if you have the strongest and most authoritarian president in the world. So it is also very important that these processes are accompanied by very meaningful people-to-people diplomacy in border areas with the involvement of regional actors, the local hakims, for example, the elders, and other important members of the communities that will ultimately have to work on the delimitation and demarcation of borders. So these will be the two big issues where, disagreements are still a possibility and hopefully without escalating to conflict. But whenever we speak of cooperation in Central Asia these days, we should not forget that, Central Asia is a region like any other region in the world where politics is present, and politics is by definition ups and downs, and it is the management of differences. So it is how differences are managed that matters, but differences will always be there, right? So it is ultimately how diplomacy works that will tell us whether Central Asia will be an area of development and prosperity, and not just for states, hopefully, but in the future also for the people themselves.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. And I wish you luck in Austria.
Thank you so very much, Agnieszka. And please, once again, enjoy Sani Almaty, and all the very best to you and the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.